Wyoming Territory, autumn of 1882. The wind hit sharp across the dry flats of Carbon County as a woman stumbled down the edge of the dirt road, her carpetbag dragging behind her, too heavy for the strength she had left. "Do not bother coming back," her husband had said, voice flat as a shovel blade. "You are always too tired to be a wife. I did not marry you to sleep through life." Her name was Selene Hartley, and she was 28, though she looked older from the weight of years spent trying to be enough. She had not cried when the door shut behind her. Not when her husband tossed her satchel onto the porch. Not even when her son and daughter peeked out from behind the curtains, too afraid to say goodbye. But now, miles from home with blistered feet and the sun dipping low, something inside her cracked. She stopped walking, dropped the bag, and sat hard in the dust, arms around her knees. She did not mean to fall asleep there, but exhaustion wrapped around her like a heavy quilt. A horse's breath stirred her hair. "You hurt?" a man asked. She blinked up into the setting sun and saw the outline of a rider. Broad shoulders, a dust-covered hat, a scar down one cheek. His voice was steady, calm. He climbed down, boots crunching softly as he came closer. "No," Selene said, trying to stand. Her legs gave out. He crouched beside her. "I will ask again. Are you hurt?" "I am tired," she whispered. "That is all." He looked at her a long moment, eyes assessing, but not unkind. "Then rest right here," he said, removing his coat and laying it over her shoulders. "You can sit by my fire tonight." She blinked. "Why?" "Because you need rest and I have fire. That is reason enough." She did not argue. She could not. She followed him a few paces to where a small camp was set, bedroll, coffee pot over embers, saddle leaned against a log. He poured her a tin cup of water and handed her a biscuit. "My name is Silas North," he said as he sat across the flame from her. "I ride fence for a cattle outfit west of Rawlins." "You?" "Selene Hartley," she said. "I do not belong anywhere right now." "Someone put you out?" "My husband," she said, voice tight. "He said I was always too tired, that I had no use." Silas nodded slowly, as though he had heard worse and better and none of it surprised him. He said nothing more, just poked the fire and handed her another biscuit. She ate in silence, and when the fire burned down, he unrolled his extra blanket and laid it a few feet from his own. "You sleep there. I will be right here if you need anything." She curled under the blanket. The earth was cold, but the fire was warm, and the last thing she saw before sleep took her was the shape of him sitting upright, watching the stars like a man who knew their names. Dawn came gentle, pink and gold across the plains. Selene woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Silas handed her a tin plate and sat beside her on the log. "You from Rawlins?" he asked. "Near it. Small homestead east of the tracks." "You have children?" She stared at her food. "Yes, 2. Flora is 6. Felix is 4. He left them behind. Said I was too much trouble to keep, but they were not." Silas's jaw tightened. He handed her a cup of coffee. "You planning to go back for them?" "I do not know how," she admitted, voice low. "He would never let me take them, and I have no place to take them to." Silas stood and walked a few steps away, his back to her. He stayed silent a long time, then turned. "You come with me," he said. "I know a place. My uncle died a year ago. Left me a cabin and 60 acres near Snake River. It is quiet, safe. Yours if you want it." Her eyes flew to his. "Why would you do that?" "Because no decent man lets a woman sleep in the dirt when he has a roof. And no woman should be kept from her own children." Selene stared at him. She did not trust kindness anymore. But there was no hunger in his eyes, no angle. Just steadiness. "I do not want your charity." "It is not charity," Silas said plainly. It is a place to rest, until you know what comes next. She stood, slowly, looked toward the horizon. Then I will come. They rode west for 3 days. Silas let her have the horse in the mornings, walked beside her through the scrub and sage, sometimes humming under his breath. At night he cooked. She fetched water. They spoke little, but the silences grew easy. On the third night, as the fire cracked and coyotes sang far off, she said, "You do not ask many questions." He looked up from where he was whittling. "Do you want me to?" She shook her head. "No, I am not used to quiet, feeling safe." Silas did not smile, but something in his eyes warmed. "You will get used to it." The cabin sat tucked against the edge of a pine grove, a split log structure with a stone chimney and a porch that faced the river. It needed mending, but it was standing, and the roof held dry. Silas swung down from his horse. "You stay here. I will go back with you to get your children." Selene's breath caught. "You would do that?" "I said I would," he said simply. "No man puts out a woman and keeps her children. Not if I have anything to say about it." He returned 3 days later with Felix in one arm and Flora holding his hand. The girl's cheeks were smudged. The boy clung to Silas like he had known him forever. Selene dropped to her knees and gathered them in, holding them so tight they squealed. She kissed their cheeks, their hair, whispered promises into their necks. Silas stood back, arms crossed, watching. "How did you? Your husband was not home. A neighbor helped me talk to the sheriff. Custody laws do not favor monsters." She stared at him. "You did all that for me?" He said nothing, just looked at her like she was something worth fighting for. That night, as the children slept on a soft bed of pine quilts, Selene stepped out onto the porch. Silas stood there, looking out toward the dark trees. "You gave me back everything," she said. "No," he said. "I just helped you get it back." She reached for his hand. He let her. "I want to stay," she said. "Not just for the cabin. For you." Silas turned to face her fully. "Then rest right here, Selene, as long as you want." And she leaned into him, head on his chest, and for the first time in years her bones did not ache. The days settled into rhythm beneath the quiet canopy of pine and sky. Selene rose early with the sun, her hands red from scrubbing, her shoulders slowly rebuilding the strength her husband had worn down to thread. Felix chased grasshoppers through the meadow behind the cabin. Flora sat by the hearth, weaving scraps of cloth into little dolls with crooked arms and button eyes. Silas kept to the work of wintering, chopping wood, checking the lines along the river where traps were laid, patching a leak in the sod roof with care that suggested he was used to doing everything alone. But he never turned away a helping hand, and when Selene offered to carry kindling or mend a torn shirt, he only nodded and made room beside him. One morning, as frost still clung to the porch rails, Flora tugged at Selene's sleeve. "Mr. North don't never talk much," she whispered. "He talks when it matters," Selene said, brushing the girl's hair with careful fingers. That evening, over a supper of rabbit stew, Silas reached for his tin cup and said, "My mother died birthing my sister. My father left before I could walk. My uncle raised me out on the Wind River line. He wasn't kind, but he was fair. When I turned 16, I rode fence for the McCall place. Been working ever since." Selene met his eyes across the table, surprised not by the words, but by the way he gave them plainly, as if offering her a stone smoothed by time. Felix slurped broth with both hands. Flora leaned her chin on the table. "Why'd you never marry?" Selene asked, soft but sure. Silas dipped his bread in the stew. Didn't see a reason to bring a woman into a life that didn't have room for her. She watched him chew, slow and steady. "And now, I've got room," he said, not looking up. That night, after the children had gone to sleep in the loft, Selene stood outside, her arms wrapped tight against the cold. The stars blinked clear above the trees. Silas joined her, his steps quiet on the porch boards. "I used to sleep through the night without dreaming," she said, eyes on the dark horizon. "Now I wake up hearing them cry, even when they aren't." Silas didn't answer right away. When he spoke, his voice was low. "Grief don't always come from losing the dead. Sometimes it's from what you lived through." She turned to him. "You ever feel like you became someone you don't know? Just to survive?" He nodded once, the movement slight. "But every day's a chance to become someone better known." She didn't speak again, just leaned her shoulder against his, and they stood like that until the cold drove them in. The next morning, Selene found a bundle of linen and coarse yarn waiting on the table. She ran her fingers over the fabric, puzzled. "For skirts," Silas said, tying his boots. "And cloaks. I saw a peddler near the river last week. Figured you'd want something for the children too." She blinked, then carefully folded the cloth. "Thank you." "Wasn't kindness," he said. "Was practical." She smiled, but said nothing. Later that week, Selene walked the riverbend with Flora and Felix trailing behind. She picked stones shaped like hearts and slipped them into her apron. When they returned, Silas was oiling the door hinge. "I was thinking," she said, brushing dust from her skirt, "we could build a coop come spring. Chickens would give us eggs, and maybe a little trade." Silas looked up. "You plan on still being here come spring?" "I do," she said, without hesitation. He wiped his hands on a cloth and stood. "Then we'll build it together." She nodded, her face steady, eyes holding his for a long moment. Inside, the fire crackled. Felix laughed as Flora tickled his ribs. The scent of wood smoke clung to Selene's hair. Outside, the wind carried snow off the mountain in slow spirals, but inside the walls they'd begun to stitch a life that held. March came with a wet wind, and the river swelled high enough to carry broken limbs and bits of ice in its churn. Selene stood on the porch with her shawl drawn tight, watching the water cut through the trees. The air smelled of thawed earth and pine rot. Beneath her feet, the boards creaked with the shift of season. Inside, Flora hummed while stitching a doll's apron. Felix was on the floor beside her, tongue between his teeth as he traced letters in a pan of ash. Silas had taught him the shapes last week, drawing letters in the dirt with a stick until the boy could copy them without help. Selene stepped down and crossed to the side of the cabin, where Silas was shaping fence rails. He worked with a rhythm that required no thought, just muscle and memory. "You've done that before," she said, nodding to the post laid across two sawhorses. "Built a corral outside Lander once. Took 2 days and a busted thumb." She leaned against the tree stump where he'd split wood all winter. "You planning to run stock?" "Maybe a few head if there's feed enough. Mule deer come close to the line means the grass is good." She watched the curve of his jaw as he worked, the way he paused to wipe sweat from his brow with the edge of his sleeve. "I used to think work like this was beneath me," she said after a while. "I'd sit on the porch and count hours until my husband came home. Thought my job was to be waiting." Silas didn't look up. "And now, I don't wait anymore. I make things happen with my hands." He set the drawknife down and met her eyes. "There's pride in that. You ought to hold on to it." She nodded, the corner of her mouth twitching. Not a smile, something quieter. Later, she boiled lye and tallow out back to make soap. Flora crushed dried lavender between stones, and Felix dropped slivers of pine resin into the pot, his face scrunched against the smell. When the sun began to dip, Silas came around the side of the cabin with a sack over his shoulder. "Found this at the trading post," he said, placing the bundle on the table. "Thought the boy could use a small slate." Felix reached for it like it was made of gold. Selene touched the cloth wrapping but didn't open it. "I've never had a man think about what my children need," she said, voice low. Silas sat down and poured himself water. "Well, I do." That night, after the children had gone to sleep, Selene sat near the hearth, sewing a patch into the elbow of Silas's shirt. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching the fire. "I seen a preacher pass through Fort Steele last month," he said. She looked up, needle paused mid-stitch. "You thinking of marrying someone?" she asked. He met her eyes. "I might be." She didn't answer at first, just folded the shirt neatly and set it aside. The fire crackled. The wind brushed against the door like a question waiting to be asked. "You've never touched me," she said. "Not once. Not even when I was near breaking. I didn't reckon you needed another hand taking something from you." She stood slowly, crossed the space between them. "I might be ready to give something, if it's asked gently." Silas reached out, his fingers brushing hers. He didn't pull her close. He waited. "Selene," he said, her name careful on his tongue. "Will you marry me?" She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She only took his hand and rested it against her cheek. "Yes." In the loft, Flora stirred but didn't wake. Felix dreamed about horses. Outside, the thaw carried on. But inside, a promise had found its place. April brought the scent of wet bark and new grass. The land softened beneath the thaw, and birds returned to the trees around the cabin, their calls weaving through the early light. Selene stood at the edge of the clearing, one hand resting on her hip, the other shielding her eyes as she looked toward the ridge where Silas had gone before sunrise. She'd woken to the sound of him whistling low as he saddled the mule, told her he needed to check a trapline that hadn't been touched since before snowfall. He'd left her with 3 hens in a pine crate and a length of chicken wire he'd bartered for with an old rifle barrel. Said it was time she had a coop of her own. She'd smiled at that, then kissed his cheek without hesitation. That was new. By midday, she had dug a shallow trench behind the cabin and sunk the corner posts, her palms raw and dirt under her nails. Flora held the hammer steady while Felix fetched water from the stream. They worked without complaint, without being told. That too was new. Silas returned near dusk, 2 rabbits tied to his saddle and a quiet look in his eyes. He paused when he saw the coop frame rising clean against the evening sky. "You built that?" "I did," she said, brushing sawdust from her skirt. Flora set the nails. Felix kept the hammer out of the mud. He nodded once, setting the rabbits down by the porch. "You need a roof on it. I was hoping you'd help with that." He leaned against the post beside her. "You're not afraid of the work anymore." "No," she said. "I'm not." They cooked the rabbits over the fire that night, the meat tender and seasoned with a pinch of dried thyme she had tucked away in a cloth pouch. It was the first time they'd eaten meat that hadn't come salted or smoked since deep winter. Felix fell asleep at the table, head tilted against Selene's arm, and Flora yawned so wide she didn't bother to cover her mouth. After the children were laid down, Selene stepped outside and found Silas seated beneath the porch beam, sharpening his blade with slow strokes. "You ever think about what kind of man you'd be if things had gone different?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Different how?" "If your uncle had been kind. If your father had stayed." The whetstone paused. "I might have been softer, or maybe not. Hard to say what's born into a man and what's beaten into him." She sat beside him, the wood cool beneath her. "You're not hard with me." His jaw shifted like he wasn't sure what to say to that. "You ever think I might leave?" she asked, not as a challenge, but a quiet wondering. "No," he said. "I don't." "Why not?" "Because you came here with nothing but your name and your children, and you made it into something steadier than I ever had. You don't walk away from what you've built with your own hands." She looked down at her palms, calloused now, a thin scar across the left where a hatchet had slipped last month. She flexed her fingers. I used to feel like I was fading, like the more I gave, the less there was of me. But now? Now? He asked. Now I feel like I'm made of something that won't wear out. He set the knife down and turned toward her. You are. You always were. She reached for his hand, resting hers lightly atop it. Do you want a family? She asked. Not just children under your roof. I mean a home that's yours in every way. I already have one, he said. But if you're asking if I want us to be bound proper, I do. I'll ride to Rawlins when the pass clears and fetch the preacher. I'll ride with you, she said. I want to say the words myself. He nodded, and for a long while they sat in the hush of evening, the warmth of the fire drifting out through the open door, the scent of pine smoke and river stone thick in the air. Inside, Flora stirred and called out in her sleep. Selene rose and brushed her skirt smooth. I'll go, she said, stepping lightly over the threshold. Silas watched her go, the curl of her hair pressed to the nape of her neck, the way her shoulders no longer curled inward. He picked up the whetstone once more, but didn't put it to the blade. Not yet. He just sat there, listening to her voice upstairs, low and even, soothing the child back into dreams. And in that moment, with the coop half built and the rabbit bones picked clean, he understood this was no longer a place to wait out winter. This was home. The preacher came on a wagon from Rawlins, drawn slow through melting ruts by a sway-backed mare. He was a slight man with a quiet manner and a Bible bound in cracked leather. Silas met him at the edge of the clearing, offered coffee and a place to rest his bones. The preacher tipped his hat and glanced at the half-finished coop, the split wood stacked high against the cabin wall, and said nothing that needed words. Selene wore a dress she made herself, stitched from deep blue calico with a collar Flora embroidered in tiny yellow stars. She'd hemmed it by lantern light, measuring twice, cutting once, every seam a small act of certainty. Her hair was pinned up, curls tucked behind her ears, and a narrow band of lace tied at her wrist, the last piece of her mother's wedding bonnet, found in the bottom of her carpetbag that first morning on the road. Silas had shaved with care and wore the same wool coat he'd used to cover her that first night. He stood with Felix at his side, the boy's hand wrapped around 2 fingers, holding them like he'd hold a fence rail, firm and easy. They spoke their vows beneath the porch beam with the sound of the river running high beyond the trees. The preacher's words were quiet, sure. Selene answered without trembling. Silas's voice was low, steady as a promise kept too long. When it was done, the preacher offered a blessing and a warm nod. Flora clapped once, shyly, then reached for her mother's hand and held it all through supper. That night, after the preacher had gone, after the children were tucked beneath quilts smelling of wood smoke and rosemary, Selene stepped into the room she now shared with Silas. It was small, with a narrow bed and a woven rug she had traded for with a jar of pickled beets. A shelf held her tin of sewing needles and a folded square of muslin where Silas kept his spare cartridge belt. The window was open a crack for air, and the smell of pine and thawed moss drifted in like a lullaby. Silas was at the wash basin, drying his hands on a cloth. She moved behind him, slid her arms around his waist, and rested her cheek against his shoulder. I never thought I'd belong in a room like this, she said. You built this room, he answered. Long before you stepped inside it. He turned and looked at her, his eyes dark in the low lamplight. She didn't look away. I want to be the kind of wife who stands equal, she said, voice quiet but certain. Not behind, not beside, just steady, like you are. You already are, he said. You've been that since the first night you didn't ask for anything, but took what was given with grace. She reached for his hand, threading her fingers with his. Neither spoke again. They didn't need to. Spring unfolded slow and deliberate, like a horse learning trust. The coop was finished with a sloped roof and a hatch flora painted with white flowers. The hens took to it without fuss, and Felix named them after stars he heard Silas mention on clear nights: Vega, Lyra, Cassiopeia. Selene planted a row of carrots and onions beside the cabin, marked with stakes carved from cottonwood. She taught Flora to blanch linen, and Felix learned to split kindling without nicking his fingers. Silas built a bench for the porch and carved her name into the underside with his pocket knife. A quiet thing he didn't tell her. She found it one evening and ran her fingers over the letters but said nothing, only added a cushion stitched from scraps of her wedding dress. In late June, a letter arrived from a cousin back east, one Selene hadn't dared write until now. It came folded inside a parcel of dried apples and a single silver spoon. The note was short, written in a hand she recognized from childhood. Said only, "You were right to leave. I'm proud of you." She didn't cry. She read it once, folded it again, and tucked it into the drawer beneath the flour sack. Silas came in with dust on his boots and a fish wrapped in oilcloth. He saw the look on her face and didn't ask. He kissed her forehead, then bent to rinse the fish in the bucket by the door. That night, they ate by lantern light, laughing at Felix's crooked knock-knock joke and Flora's stubborn refusal to eat turnips. Afterward, they sat close by the fire, her hand wrapped around his, the children dozing with their feet in each other's laps. As the fire burned low, Selene leaned against Silas's shoulder, her fingers tracing the seam of his sleeve. "What do we do now?" she asked, not from fear, but from wonder. "We keep building," he said. "Whatever we want." Years passed, but the rhythm never broke. Felix grew tall and sure-handed, took to horses like he'd been born in the saddle. Flora learned to read with a hunger that outpaced the books they could trade for. She wrote letters east and west and tucked pressed flowers between the pages. Selene gave birth to a daughter one summer morning, beneath the same porch beam where she'd spoken her vows. Silas held the child with reverence that made Selene weep, though she didn't expect to. They named the girl Ruth. She had her mother's eyes and her father's quiet. They planted more rows, built a smokehouse, traded for a second mule. Each year the work got lighter, not because it was less, but because it was shared. Every winter, Silas carved a new star into the beam above the hearth. One for each year they'd made it through. By the time Ruth could walk, there were 5. By the time she could read, there were 9. And by the time gray threaded through Selene's hair and Silas's hands stiffened in the cold, there were 23. The stars stayed steady as the roof, and the fire never failed. Their love was not loud, nor grand, nor written in letters. It lived in the way she handed him his coat without asking, in the way he left the porch light burning when she walked the garden late, in the way they reached for each other always with the same hand that once held nothing at all. And they never faded, not even a little,